Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome, this is Advanced Reaction Engineering course. Now, in this course we cover a lot of ground, general applications of chemical reaction engineering to our requirements in chemical process industry and as well as in daily life and so on. So, what I would like to do in this session is just to give you an overall perspective of what I want to do in this lecture series of maybe 30-40 hours. Okay. So, let me just run through one by one, just give you a feel for what is contained in each of these modules. Okay. So, let me get a beginning. So, we begin with an introduction. I mean the object here is to try and bring to your attention what we will do in this course, of course, and then what is the methodology that we will follow, and how we plan to address various issues and how we will explain the principles through various examples and so on. So, the methodology we will try to adopt here is one of problem solving, so that we learn how to derive the equations that describe a certain process and or certain idealizations that we will look at, and also show how it applies to different situations. Okay. So, that is the way we will go around in this course, and if you I am sure all of you are familiar, but see, we will look at what I see as design equation for ideal reactors. Okay. Now, I mean in the sense that we have a reaction equipment, and that reaction equipment in which a certain reaction takes place, let us say A goes to B or A goes to B plus C, whatever. So, what we need to know is how this particular material that is entering a reaction vessel, how it will undergo reaction, to what extent it will undergo reaction, what are the parameters that will determine the extent to which the reaction would occur, and most importantly, what is the size of the equipment that is required for a certain extent of reaction, of course, as our interest. And in some cases, we are not looking at simply continuous operation, we are looking at batch operations, in which case our interest is to find out what is the time that is required for a given extent of reaction and so on. And there are situations in which we are neither doing continuous nor doing batch, we are doing something like semi-continuous, semi-batch operations, in which case our interest is to really understand how the process can be written down in terms of mathematics, so that we can tell what might happen to the process and how we can intervene in a way so that the process can be made to move in the direction of our interest. Okay. So, the design equations for ideal reactors is essentially a way of trying to idealize what might be happening, and so that our equations are able to approximate what might happen in real life. Just as an example, I mean more of it you will see when you actually look at these. Just to put it in the perspective, let us say you have an equipment like this, okay, and in which this reaction is occurring, flow is coming in and flow is going out. Okay. So, this has got a certain volume V, a reaction A goes to B, or let us say A or A plus B going to C plus D. Okay. Now, you will recognize that A, B, C, D, A can be a gas, B can be a liquid, it can be same, phases may be the same, phases may be different, products may have some of it may be a gas, some of it, there are various kinds of situations that are likely. So, for each of these situations, our equations must be able to appropriately take into account. So, we will look at simple situations as we go along, we will modify and then take into account more variations that might occur in real life. Okay. So, the design equations, if you are looking at design equations, okay, the object of design equation is to put down in simple terms how inputs and outputs, or inputs in initial and final, can be related in terms of parameters that you and I understand, recognize, and so on. In the chemical engineering literature or chemical process industry, frequently we see what we call as tubular reactors. Okay. Now, tubular reactors are essentially pipes of various sizes, and typically they contain a catalyst, okay, which is feed is coming in and going out. Okay. Tubular reactors are common in the industry because they are easy to build, and then the flow fields can be easily understood, can be measured. A lot of techniques have been evolved over a number of years to understand the fluid mechanics, and therefore, it is a common device which is employed in the industry. Okay. So, often we talk about plug flow in our tubular reactor designs equations. By plug flow, I mean, in the sense, the reason why we sort of idealize situations like this is that they are easier to treat, and therefore, we are able to get equations that is able to quickly idealize what might be otherwise difficult to understand and predict. So, we have a first principle understanding of what might happen. By plug flow, what is meant is that if you have a fluid element here, it sort of gets in, it sort of moves through the equipment, and emerges. And there is another fluid element which comes and moves through the equipment and emerges. In other words, what we are saying is that if we recognize or idealize a flow through an equipment as plug flow, it only means that these fluid elements pass without recognizing the existence of other fluid elements. Therefore, the time of residence of these fluid elements can be very precisely calculated, and therefore, we are able to tell how long they have spent in the equipment, and therefore, we can tell what is the extent to which the reaction may have taken place based on the numbers that we have in our hand. So, plug flow is an idealized version of the reaction equipment that you will see in the process industry, often called as tubular reactors. So, we will set up equations as we go along to describe what is called as plug flow reactors. Little earlier we talked about stirred vessels. These are all stirred vessels. Okay. Now, stirred vessels can be a batch equipment or can be a continuous equipment. Okay. Equipment. Now, batch equipment means that there is a flow inside, but there is no flow out, in the sense it is batch, there is no flow in. So, you start with a certain amount of fluid here, and you process that fluid for a certain length of time, and we set up equations that would describe what might be going on inside the equipment. In other words, there is no inflow, there is no outflow. Therefore, whatever happens in the reaction is like it's accounted for by the process or the reaction kinetics that is responsible for that reaction to take place. So, batch, you will find batch equipments are generally quite common in small scale industry. If you go to paint industry, if you go to pharmaceutical industry, or oil industry, and various kinds of industries, where you want to process them in small scale, because the scale of operations are such that the demand is such that it only is amenable to small scales of operation, or in places like pharmaceutical industry, where purities and then quality etc. are so stringent that you must be able to keep track of in which batch it was produced, so that in case you want to recall that product at a later stage, it might be possible to actually inform the dealers to recall that product in case it is found to be unsatisfactory for whatever reasons. So, pharmaceutical industry batch processes are quite common. Okay. Now, so a batch equipment is essentially a vessel which has got, there is provision for inlet outlet, there is provision for entering inside and cleaning and so on. So, it is quite common of various sizes, maybe 10, 20, 5 to 10 kiloliters is typically the sizes you will see in the industry. There is something called CSTR, which is quite common in chemical engineering literature, which is called continuous stirred tank reactor, which is it's an equipment like this, where there is continuous input and there is a continuous output. These are the valves. So, these are open, so that there is continuous flow and continuous output. In other words, what you are seeing here is that chemical reaction takes place as the flow comes in and goes out. And since many of these reactions could be quite exothermic, there are coils which might be carrying a cooling or heating fluid, so as to ensure that the reaction conditions are able to be achieved because of this heating or cooling medium. So, the continuous stirred tank reactor is one very common device that you might see in laboratories, in the universities and research labs, and in the industry, where the scales of operations are relatively larger, not very large, relatively larger. Now, continuous stirred tank reactors in the process industry, the most common we might see in places. For example, you will find that in polymer industry, where you have to deal with very viscous situations, you will find that stirred tank provides you a good amount of mixing and so on, so that the heat transfer can be satisfactory. So, you will find continuous reaction equipment in polymer industry. Okay. There are several other situations where continuous reaction equipments are quite common, because of the fact that it permits you to continuously input and output, at the same time ensure that the temperatures and process conditions are kept uniform. So, CSTR and batch are the stirred equipment that you will see in the process industry, and the tubular reactors or plug flow devices that we call is quite common in the very large scale petroleum and other industries. Okay. So, for both these situations, there are design equations which we call as ideal reactors. So, what is meant by ideal reactors? By ideal, we mean that the conditions in different parts of the equipment in terms of temperature, pressure, concentrations are uniform. Or in other words, the fluid, as soon as it enters, it is able to get itself mixed thoroughly, so that the conditions inside the equipment is same as conditions that is leaving the equipment. That is what is called as a continuous stirred tank reactor, very popular in the chemical engineering literature. So, when we said design equations for ideal reactors, we will be looking at these two situations and set up equations that will describe how reactions take place in these two, how reactions can be understood as they take place in these two kinds of equipments. Now, we find in our experience in process industry that a reaction does not go to completion for whatever reasons. Let us just give an example. Let us say you have a reaction equipment, feed is coming in, feed is going out. Now, we find that this is the reactor. So, this is what is called as the plug flow recycle reactor. Okay. Now, when would you engage a process of this nature? We would engage process of this nature when we find that the products that come out of this reaction requires to be recycled. There would be situations that you will learn as you go along, are situations in which the products have to be recycled. They have to be recycled because we find that the products are able to facilitate the rate at which the reaction occurs. This could be one reason. or the products contain a lot of energy like heat, for example. It is a very high temperature, so you got to make use of that energy for your process. That could be another example. Okay. So, there could be several situations. Of course, another example could be that the reaction has not gone to completion, therefore, you want to put a separator somewhere here and then separate the products and then recycle the unreacted products. So, there are various situations that you will encounter where recycle is required. Now, when recycle is required, we need to set up our design equations which will take into account the effect of recycle, the effect of the recycle on the size of the equipment, number one, effect of recycle on the extent of reaction. There are various issues that we must consider when we provide a recycle. Okay. It can be steady state, it can be unsteady state, because you might be encountering situations in which you also want to understand how long it takes for a certain process to reach steady state, or you are interested in the unsteady state part of the process because you are starting up the process and you want to know how long it has taken to reach steady state. Various issues that might come up in a process that we would like to understand, and then set up our mathematics so that we can actually tell how long it will be before the steady state is achieved. So, we need situations like this in process industry. So, we will set up equations that takes into account the effects of recycle, so that we can set up our equations appropriately. Okay, having said this, we want to look at plug flow recycle reactors. Some illustrations, illustrative examples. Now, what we will when I say plug flow illustrative examples, what I like to bring to your attention to in such lectures is that what are the physical situations where you might want to do a recycle, and how would that recycle benefit you in a process. Let us take an example. Say for example, A going to B, let us say as an example, where the reaction is autocatalytic. What is meant by autocatalytic? Autocatalytic, we mean that the reaction rate at which this reaction occurs is dependent on A, it is also dependent on B. Now, when a reaction is autocatalytic, which means that the rate at which the reaction moves really depends upon how much of product has been put into the system. So, clearly speaking, unless you put product appropriately, the reaction does not move. Now, if you look at the recycle, this recycle device provides a way by which you can put products back into the feed. So, autocatalytic reaction is a good example where recycle becomes very, very important for the process to move forward. So, autocatalytic reactions require recycle, and very clearly there might be an optimum recycle at which you must operate, and so on, which is important from the point of view of process optimization. All those features will have to be appropriately taken into account into our design equations, plus it has to be appropriately explained. It has to be appropriately explained when we look at illustrative examples. Now, if you look at real life, for example, what are the real life situations where we have to deal with autocatalytic reactions? The finest example you will think of are biological reactions. Say for example, you have, let us say you have a reaction, I am just giving a small example, you have C6 H12 O6, this is glucose, it is reacting with some cells, let us say Saccharomyces cerevisiae. This is a fungi, it is a fungi which feeds on glucose under certain conditions of pH and temperature and oxygen tension and so on, gives you alcohol, it gives you alcohol and carbon dioxide. Okay. Now, you can see here is 3 C2H5OH and CO2, you can balance this. How many carbon is there? You can balance this anyway, it is not so critical right now. Okay. So, you have glucose giving you alcohol and water, okay, alcohol and carbon dioxide. Now, this particular reactions you will find that if unless you put in Saccharomyces and get the appropriate conditions, you will not be able to produce alcohol. So, what is being said is that So, the presence of Saccharomyces makes this reaction happen. In that process, more cells are formed. Okay. So, in principle, these cells can be harvested and then put back into the process. Okay, that is one way. Or alternatively, you find that as more and more cells are formed, it is able to catalyze the reaction in the forward direction. So, autocatalytic is a good example in which you will find that the addition of the product, which cells are a product, to enhances the rate of forward reaction. Just look at some more examples of recycled reactors. Now, there is another situation that you would have seen in real life, I know some of you may have seen, is if you go to a waste treatment plant. See, if you, all over the world, you will find that we produce a lot of, let us say, sewage, which comes out of human settlements. Okay. There could be waste coming from dairies, which contains a lot of waste material. So, typically what is done is that these materials is taken into a basin, in which you put in oxygen. You put in oxygen by aeration, okay. And then in the presence of oxygen and the sewage, which contains organics like carbohydrates and things like that, the cells which is present in that environment grows, and as a result you will find that the waste material gets consumed, and then the water that comes out is relatively clean, or this is called as waste treatment. This is called waste treatment. Okay. Now, you will find that sewage, let us say sewage contains carbohydrate. So, you are putting oxygen. Okay. So, this gets oxidized. So, it becomes carbon dioxide and water, and the cells that are present in the water produce more cells. Okay. So, this is another example. This is another example where the whole reaction goes forward only if there are cells, and the cells produce more cells, and the effect of these cells is to further enhance the reaction. Or in other words, this is another very good example of autocatalytic reactions. Okay. Now, whether you use devices, we can use various types of devices. We can use devices which is called stirred tanks, which is called, these are all stirred tanks. Okay. We can use stirred tanks as devices for doing this process, or you can do recycled devices like what I have said. In both cases, the principles are that the product, which is cell, enhances the rate at which the reaction occurs. Okay. This is what we are trying to say. So, plug flow recycled devices or recycles in general are very common in process industry, and we need equations to take care of how to deal with recycles in real life, and that is what we will do in these kinds of lectures. Now, we often find, if it is not very unusual that in chemical process there are many reactions that occur. There are many reactions that occur, and we have to deal with what is called as multiple reaction. Multiple reactions. What do you mean by multiple reactions? What we want to say here is that, suppose let us say, I am just as an example, I write A plus B going to C plus D. This is a single reaction. Okay. Now, if I want to talk about a multiple reaction, I can write the multiple reaction like this: A1 alpha 1 A1 plus alpha 1 2 A2 up to say alpha 1 N AN. Similarly, alpha P1 A1 plus alpha P2 A2 up to alpha Pn AN equal to 0. What is being said here is that we have written A plus B equal to C plus D as a reaction. This can also be written as C plus D minus of A minus of B equal to 0. It's what is being said is that if you have a chemical reaction, you can write it as an algebraic equation. It's convenient. Okay. Or if you have many reactions occurring, as I have said here, alpha 1 A1 to alpha 1 AN, as this is one reaction, there are p such reactions. So, there are p reactions here. Now, the important point when there are large number of reactions are happening. So, we also like to know, how to manage, how to understand very large number of reactions. Okay. Now, therefore, we need a systematic procedure by which we are able to deal with very large number of reactions. so that we can account for them, we can find out what is happening in the reactions and so on. So, there is a general technique which is used to understand how many reactions are independent. Independence of reactions is an idea which has come in because of the fact that there are many reactions are happening. Okay. Once we recognize what is called the independence of reactions, we can also understand that if there are many reactions occurring, how many of them are independent, how many of them are dependent and so on. Just to illustrate this, let me just illustrate this what I am saying. Say for example, you have a reaction A going to B and the reaction B going to A. What is meant by this? We are saying that this reaction A to B is, and this is actually a reversible reaction. That means, reaction go in the forward direction, it can go in the reverse direction. So, which means when we are conducting a reaction A going to B, in principle perhaps both the rate processes are occurring. Okay, both the rate processes are occurring. What we see is that the reaction seems to go from A to B because one rate process is faster than the other. Therefore, the net you see that the reaction is going in one direction. And there are techniques, I mean, you would have learned or you will learn as you go along, by which you can actually measure the rate process in both directions. There are techniques available and there are methods available. You will learn all these as you go along. Therefore, in principle all these are possible to be measured. So, but the fact of interest to us is that if there is A going to B and B going to A, how many of these reactions are independent is a question that we frequently will ask ourselves. Now, it is common sense, by looking at it we can say that if you just take one sample of, suppose let us say reaction is occurring in an equipment like this, A going to B, B going to C. If you just take a sample of A and of this material and analyze for A. Okay. If you analyze for A, start with Na0 as the total moles and then we determine what is the moles at any other time. So, once you know this difference, you can tell what is the amount of B that has been formed, because that is coming from stoichiometry. In other words, what we are trying to say is that if you know the independence of reactions, you can tell what is the composition of the system. So, what is generally suggested in multiple or in what is called as reaction networks is that we determine the number of independent reactions. We just determine number of independent reactions. Okay. Once we know the number of independent reactions, we can tell the composition of the system fully, because that is what will determine the composition of the system. And as you go along, we will use these general methods to deal with multiple reactions, and you will find as you go along, particularly in biology, when huge number of reactions are occurring, you will find it extremely useful to deal with use these techniques, because it makes it very convenient, and there are computational methods available, so by which we can deal with them very effectively. Now, having said this, let me sort of draw attention to some very interesting situations that we might encounter. One situation which we will is multiple reactions in soil environment. Okay. Now, as you all know that just give you a small example, just to put this in the context. Suppose you have a reaction, let us say NO2 minus giving you NH4 plus. So, NO2 minus giving you NO3 minus. So, NO2 minus reacting with NH4 plus gives you N2 plus H2O. Okay. 1, 2, 3. And then we could also have a situation that NH4 plus which is formed in reaction 1 goes for cell synthesis. How does it happen? This ammonium nitrogen is actually incorporated into cells due to various reactions that happen in the soil environment. Of course, you could also have a situation that the carbohydrates gets oxidized to give you carbon dioxide and water plus energy. So, the context here is something like this. I mean this in this planet we produce close to about 2 billion tons of grains to feed the population of the world. Okay. And all this comes from about 1300 million hectares of cultivated land in different parts of the world, India included, and the cultivated land in India is something like out of total land area of about 180 or 200 million hectares is the total cropped area in this country. So, in the sense that if you want to understand what is happening in soil environment, we can understand this by looking at these 5 reactions. Okay. Now, we can do experiments to find out what happens to NO2 minus, NO3 minus, NH4 plus, and then carbohydrate can be measured appropriately. Or in other words, we can do a small experiment to find out how these nutrients NO2 minus, NO3 minus, NH4 plus, and then carbohydrate is actually channeled into various pathways through simple experiments. Okay. Now, you notice here, this is what this, if I call this as reaction 1 and call this reaction 2, call this as reaction 3, call this as reaction 4, call this as reaction 5. Essentially what we are trying to say here is that here are just 5 reactions, and these 5 reactions are able to tell us how you are producing various cells. It can be food crops in around the world. So, through some simple experiments, I mean, and the kind of power that these experiments have on is enormous. As you can see, you can do these experiments and find out how the nitrogen that we add to soil and how they are related to production of food crops, and how the carbohydrate that might be present in the soil environment is used for the production of food crops. You see, these kinds of interlinkages we can understand by doing some simple experiments and in multiple reactions using a soil environment in a laboratory. You do not have to go into the field, and you will find that you are able to get results which are able to explain what happens in different parts of the world, giving you a feel for how fairly simple experiments done in a laboratory which does not cost you a lot, it gives you an insight into very complex happenings in agriculture, plantations, plantation crops in the world, and so on. Okay. So, that is the power of trying to understand multiple reactions in soil, of which we will look at some examples to illustrate how we can get insights into fairly complicated situations using fairly simple techniques. So, next we will try to look at is what we call as catalyst deactivation. Now, the context to looking at catalyst deactivation is that if you look at our process industry, many of them require catalysts for the reactions to take place. I mean, we know of ammonia synthesis, of which Haber won a Nobel Prize in 1915 for the development and for the discovery of the synthesis catalyst. Of course, a lot of improvements have come since then, and there are, in fact, catalyst is the center of many important processes which make life so easy for us today compared to what it was maybe 100 years ago. So, but catalysts undergo deactivation. Okay. Fundamentals of deactivation is a chemistry that we must know, so that we can prevent it, we can improve upon it, and so on. But from the point of view of chemical engineers who run processes, what is important is that we would like to know what is the kinetics of catalyst deactivation, at what rate they deactivate, so that we have some way for understanding how long our catalyst will last in the process environment, so that we can replace them. Alternatively, we can regenerate them appropriately. So, the whole process of catalyst deactivation requires you to find out methods by which we can understand the kinetics of deactivation. Kinetics. So, we must know the kinetics of deactivation. I mean, for which we must do measurements, and even if you do measurements, you see, what is important is that we must know how to use those measurements to derive and to get the kinetic information of our interest. So, what is important in catalyst deactivation is to be able to develop our mathematics to represent what is going on in the process, so that we can get the information of our interest. So, in these lectures on catalyst deactivation, what we will try to emphasize and give you methods is to how do we conduct our experiments, so that we can get data in a form that we can use to extract the deactivation kinetics from our experiments. So, this is what is the content of the catalyst deactivation that we will do in these lectures. Okay. Now, if you know, if I say that catalyst deactivation kinetics is given by an equation of this form, okay, some function of concentrations and so on. So, our important thing is to recognize that that what is the value of m, what is this function which determines the deactivation kinetics. So, that when we write the rate at which the catalyst deactivates by this function, we are able to convert this and appropriately integrate this into our design in the reactor design. So, that we are able to understand how this process under catalyst deactivation will run. So, that we can appropriately tune the process to take care of this deactivation and ensure that we produce products at the rate at which we have designed that plant for. So, the object of this set of lectures is to determine this function. So, that we are able to go forward and use this information for our design, operation and control of processes involving catalysts. Now, there is a related issue which we must bear in mind. So, what I call here as process evaluation under catalyst deactivation. Now, what we would try to learn here is that, say for example, let us say we have a reactor, okay, and then let us say it goes through a separator, products come out, okay, and then the unreacted goes back. And this is the most common that we will see in the process industry. There is a reactor, there is a separator. All right. Now, if I call this as f is 0, if I call this as f a let us say a goes to b as an example. Now, what we will see in a process is that as this catalyst, there is a catalyst here, there is a catalyst here, which deactivates, this process deactivates. So, what you would expect as this deactivates, the amount of product that you will produce here will keep on decreasing. And clearly, which means the amount of product that formed here is decreasing, and therefore, what you are going to get here is also will decrease. Now, this separator has been designed to process a certain amount of the product. Now, as this keeps decreasing, you will find that this separator is not working to your design. So, it is suboptimal, and therefore, your process is not satisfactory. Now, clearly, when you design this reaction equipment, we have to anticipate what is the deactivation. We have to anticipate the effects of this deactivation. A is the activity, and appropriately design your process, okay, which means that if your rate at which component A that is formed, let us say this is the activity which is changing some other function C. So, this effect you should account for in the design. So, that with time as this catalyst activity keeps on decreasing, there must be a process tuning that you will do, or process adjustments that you will do, which will ensure that the catalyst, even though if it deactivates, the product that comes out here does not change with time. Okay. So, that in other words, there are strategies by which we can run processes despite the fact that there is deactivation, and it is these strategies that we will learn